Episode 3. If you have not watched the first and second episode yet, you have missed a lot. I advise you to watch it first to understand the events of the story. You will find the first and second episode in the description or in the channel. Let's go. We did not know how much time we had spent inside the tunnel, but every step brought us closer to the inevitable confrontation. Suddenly, we saw a faint light seeping from one of the corners. There was something moving in the darkness ahead of us. We began to approach slowly, and as we got closer, we heard a faint voice speaking in Vietnamese. There was a small group of Viet Cong hiding inside the tunnel, trying to sneak out without being noticed. When they realized we had discovered them, they started shooting at us. I was at the front, and I immediately began to return fire. The battle inside the tunnel was short but deadly. It ended after a few minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. After securing the tunnel and ensuring there were no remaining enemies, we decided to return to the surface. Our mission was successful. We emerged from the tunnel with our bodies exhausted and smeared with mud and blood. Every step felt heavy, not only because of physical fatigue but also because of the scenes I had witnessed inside the tunnel. This battle was a harsh experience that left its marks on everyone. When we returned to the open air, the scene before us was horrifying. Smoke was still rising from the destroyed tunnels, and exhausted soldiers were scattered on the ground, trying to catch their breath. I took a moment to gather my thoughts. I sat on the ground and took out a water bottle from my bag to quench my thirst. I looked around and saw the other soldiers, some receiving treatment for injuries, while others were trying to comprehend what had happened. The prevailing feeling was exhaustion, but there was also a sense of relief that we were still alive. I began to feel the effects of the shock showing on me. My hands were shaking a little, and my heart was racing. I couldn't forget those faces I saw in the tunnel, the enemy soldiers who met their end at my hands. I didn't see them as just enemies, but as human beings with their own lives and stories. This thought weighed heavily on my conscience. As I sat there, I remembered Mike and the other colleagues we lost in this battle. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that I hadn't been able to save them. I recalled how Mike was trying to fix his weapon and how I couldn't reach him in time. These losses made me feel helpless and lost. We took time to transport the wounded and dead back to the base. The scene was incredibly sad, as we carried our comrades who had lost their lives with honor, knowing they would not return home. The atmosphere was filled with sorrow, and every step reminded us of the weight of the losses we had endured. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived at the base, the other soldiers greeted us with stern faces, knowing that our mission had been difficult and that we returned with fewer numbers. The wounded were immediately taken to the field hospital for treatment, while the bodies of the dead were placed in wooden boxes to be sent back to their homes. We sat in silence around the fire that night, each of us reflecting on what had happened. There wasn't much to say. Words were not enough to express the emotions that overwhelmed us. We tried to find some comfort in being together, but even that was not enough to ease the pain we felt. I spoke with the commander that night, feeling the need to understand whether what we were doing had any meaning. I asked him about the purpose of all this, about the reasons that kept us fighting despite all these losses. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "We are here because we have to be here. We have no choice but to move forward, even if we don't always understand why." During my conversation with the commander, I began to realize that this war was not just about the enemy we were fighting, but also about the internal battle we were fighting within ourselves. We had to deal with fear, doubt, and guilt, and try to remain strong despite everything. But I knew that this would be much harder than I had imagined. As time passed, I began to feel that the war was no longer just a battle against an external enemy, but had become a struggle against myself, against all those emotions that were overwhelming me. I saw my comrades suffering in the same way, and we tried to support each other, but the truth was that each of us was fighting our own battle. There was talk of a new mission looming on the horizon, and we had to be ready for it. But I wasn't sure if I could continue. These thoughts consumed my mind, pushing me to think about escape, about leaving everything behind and returning to a normal life, away from all this violence. But deep down, I knew that escape wouldn't be the solution. There was something that tied me to the place and to the people I had fought alongside. It wasn't just about duty. It was a sense of responsibility toward those soldiers who had become like family to me. We had been through so much together, and it was hard to leave them to face their fate alone. In the following days, news began to pour in about the preparations for the upcoming mission. The leadership was working on a new plan to attack enemy positions in another area. We had to be ready to move at any moment, and we knew that this mission could be more dangerous than its predecessors. Despite all the fatigue and exhaustion I felt, there was something inside me pushing me to move forward. Perhaps it was this sense of duty or loyalty to my comrades, or maybe it was the desire to overcome my fear. I knew that this war would not end easily, and that I would face more battles, but I was ready to stand and confront once again. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of drums announcing the start of preparations for the mission. The sky was overcast, as if reflecting the anxiety we felt. I took a deep breath and headed towards the armory to prepare myself once more. The upcoming battle was approaching, and I had no choice but to be ready for it, no matter what challenges awaited me. But with every step I took towards the future, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind, in those jungles and dark tunnels that had become the stage of my life in this war. I realized that I might come out of this war a completely different person, someone carrying scars that may never heal. Nevertheless, I was determined to face whatever would come, knowing that the road ahead was long and difficult, and that the end was still far away. With this conflicting feeling of determination and fear, I began to prepare for the next part of this journey, which I did not know where it would lead me, but I was ready to face whatever would come my way. The weeks after the last battle were filled with intensive preparations and training. We began to prepare for a new mission, but this time the task seemed more serious than before. The news was talking about a fortified Vietnamese stronghold, full of traps and tunnels stretching for many kilometers underground. The task of eliminating this stronghold was a strategic necessity, but everyone knew that this task would be more like suicide. One night, as we gathered around the campfire, we began talking about the upcoming mission. We tried to dispel our fears with conversation and laughter, but deep down, we knew that fear was creeping into our hearts, and that the traps awaiting us in those tunnels could be our end. I started to notice how we had all become more reserved and cautious, even in ordinary conversation. We didn't know who among us might not return after this mission. On the morning the attack was decided, the atmosphere was stifling, and the sky was overcast. We moved in a long line through the dense jungle, with the wind carrying the sense of damp earth and decaying trees. I felt as though nature itself was involved in this war, silently observing us as we headed towards an unknown fate. Our feet ached under the weight of our military boots, and each step brought us closer to the battle. When we arrived at the fortress site, we saw signs of previous battles on the ground. It was clear that fights had taken place here before, and the scene reminded us that we were not the first to attempt to breach this place. Our teams began distributing tasks, and my group was assigned to enter one of the side tunnels to clear it of enemies and secure it so that the other soldiers could advance. We entered the tunnel cautiously, with the humidity surrounding us as if it were sucking the breath out of us. We moved slowly, navigating through the darkness that enveloped us from all sides. Everything seemed mysterious and frightening, as if the walls themselves were watching us. The tunnels would unexpectedly narrow and widen, making progress slow and difficult. I was in the lead, and I felt that each step could be my last. As we advanced inside the tunnel, something caught my attention. I noticed that the ground looked unusual in a certain area, as if it had been tampered with recently. I stopped the team and signaled for them to stay in their positions. I began to carefully examine the ground, and my instincts told me that there was a hidden trap here. But before I could determine if there really was a trap, what I feared happened. In a fleeting moment, I felt the ground collapse beneath my feet. I couldn't retreat or move quickly enough. Suddenly, I found myself falling into a deep pit, filled with sharp stakes skillfully placed. I landed hard on one of the stakes, feeling a sharp pain tearing through my body. I couldn't scream. All I felt was helplessness and shock. I knew that I had fallen into one of the traps we had feared. The pain was unbearable, and my breaths were short and labored. I tried to move, but each movement only intensified and deepened the pain. Blood was pouring from my wounds, and I began to feel life slipping away from me. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I was certain that I wouldn't be able to escape this trap alive. But before I completely lost consciousness, I heard the voices of my comrades approaching. They were searching for me, and I could hear their voices getting closer to the pit. I felt a hand reach out to me, helping me stay conscious. It was my comrade Jack, whom I had known since the beginning of the war. Episode 4? Available in the channel.